I'm very happy to welcome Margaret Avison, the distinguished poet, to Scarborough College. It gives me special pleasure to welcome her back to the college because she helped us to begin, and in the very early days of the college made it a much more human place than it otherwise might have been. You will hear Miss Avison in conversation with 3 students of Scarborough College.
I'm John Malette, and with me are Claudette Jones and Mike Caroline. And if I may, I'll begin our conversation with Miss Avison by asking you to comment on found poetry.
John Robert Colombo. It's a bad place to start.
Or your opinion of his poetry.
I've written one found poem from something I heard in a streetcar, and I think that's more legit than stringing together what's already been written as something else.
You think?
And I feel that the William Lyon Mackenzie stuff is pretty good as it was.
There isn't as much found poetry as there is poetry found, perhaps. Do you think?
Found poetry tends to be used of this realigning of something that's already there. I don't think it'll last long. There's too much good poetry people aren't reading. That's mean.
Miss Avison, you began to publish your poetry during the war, is that correct?
Periodical.
How did you go about
Always.
having your first poem published, your very first one?
I knew the editor of the Canadian Forum. It was Eleanor Graham at that time. Met her in a job where I was working in a library and she was using the library. She asked me for a poem and printed it.
Do you revise most of your work, or does it appear as first written?
I revise as I go along, as I guess everybody does. If you call that process, crossing out the words and changing them in the speed of writing. The second kind of revising, I think everybody who writes ought to know about, that if you're writing more than about 5 lines, your creative energy sags, so that you often find that the last third of a poem is shorthand notes for what you meant to be writing. And if you can catch that within 48 hours, you can usually get back the energy and write the poem that you've got notes for. And when you read young poets, often the quality falls away towards the end because they haven't known that trick, so I think that's important.
Miss Avison, you've been called well, I guess you'd say an intellectual poet. Do you agree with this title?
I would say an inward poet, which pretty well came to the same thing. The first book I thought was clear because I hadn't showed the poetry to enough people. I discovered they couldn't understand it. The second book, I think, is less intellectual, and I hope by the time I die to be able to write nursery rhymes.
Well, that pretty well leads to my second question. I was wondering who you feel your audience is, or even the Canadian audience for poetry, if there is one special audience.
I'm sure there's not one special audience. I think that if Senate News didn't control what was in the drugstore and in the station, that there'd be a much bigger audience than there is. I'd like to see Canada Council funds spent on getting different things onto the counters in the drugstore and the station. And when I write, I certainly don't write for any selected audience, nor probably for a particular person, unless the poem makes that clear, On your 25th wedding anniversary to my friend Julia, an exception, You asked about Canadian as an audience. Do you really feel that yourself?
I really don't know. I feel that the audience is getting smaller as time goes on because people care less and less about poetry.
More and more people write it. Nobody ever did read it, and they still don't.
That's one thing
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you. Do you think there's a boundary between the amateur and the accomplished poet? And if so, when did you cross this line? Because there are so many young people writing poetry today, but you couldn't... Who calls them poets, really?
The accomplished poet might be the poet writing the first thing they're aware is a poem. So I wouldn't say the boundary is somewhere along a time sequence at all. I think it's that elusive business of the difference between good and bad. You know at the extreme something's very, very good, and you know at another extreme this isn't there at all. But where along the spectrum any given poem is, it's hard to say. But I don't think it's a matter of how often you've done it. You know, I think some people's first writing is amazing. Then if they try to repeat that experience, they may fall off a bit, and then they begin to read a lot and practice a lot, and they're doing good work. So.
Do you find much of the poetry today is more just sensationalism? Just poetry for the sake of writing something, just writing anything, writing on conflicts in society or the Vietnam War, just because it's making the news today?
What puts topics in people's minds, though? I think that any subject could be a subject for a poem. It's how it's realized, the intensity of the writing. Sensational, too. That varies with the how of the reading as well as the writing. So that I wouldn't close anything off to anybody if they can make it.
With respect to topic, do you feel that you have a role as a poet in society? That you have any sort of mission at all yourself, or this
I haven't a role.
Of course, would be related to your to the question of what your audience is.
Am I out to get somebody with something like that?
Not get, but convey or change.
Ideally, I would say no, because just as I wouldn't say I had a role, because I would try to just be, and that's away from role-playing. I would say that if you have a message and you wrap it up in a poetic form, you've got something already that's not real poetry. Where if what you mean and how you state it is together, somebody might receive it as message and unwrap the poetry and put it there and say the message is here, and the extent to which they can do that, they're faulting me, I think.
You have no such intentions of relating the
We're skirting an issue,
of
maybe, because certainly, because I am now a Christian, I would like everything I do and am to represent that. But if I set about figuring it out, ruling out this subject and that word and putting in this subject and that word and thinking of how I want you to react, I may as well stay away from poetry, because you can't control being. And if it doesn't come across, I don't want to try and make it.
Do you feel then that poetry is much less of a craft now than it once was, in that the style means nothing and the message means everything? Or do you think it's becoming this way?
No, I'm trying to say you can't separate them. That for really communicating, you have to have what is said and how it is said so interwoven that they are inseparable. The craft is the being. you know, I ought to think so-and-so, and you can put on the mask of one who thinks so-and-so, but if you really think so-and-so, it comes across better. See what I mean? It's that business of the being of what is governing the expression. All that you read and all that you practice develops the capacity for being in fusion like that. I guess I am an intellectual. That sounds terribly hard.
Could you explain exactly what you mean by the optic heart? I found that in your poem called Snow.
It's that same thing we're talking about, the whole person responding, seeing not just as a sense experience with the feeling somewhere else, but seeing with your heart and beating with your ears and, you know, coming together in wholeness.
But you do have a message.
Message means what to you? You know, I know the linguistic term, message, sender, receiver. Is that what you mean? Because in that strictly linguistic sense, sure, I have a message. As you have, as each of us has. Is that what you mean?
I think so, yeah. It's...
Like I open my mouth, something comes out, you hear something, and the something is different from what I speak, different from what you hear.
Your message, it almost seems to be not for universal sort of understanding.
As I said, I'm ashamed of the degree of inwardness of the first book. I think it's real schizophrenic. That first book, I didn't realize how withdrawn much of the voice in it was until people actually read. But therefore it wasn't my intention. My feeling about reader and poet is that a statement made in poetry comes from a community feeling, not from a just me feeling. That I know the difference between something I might put in a letter and something that would turn into a poem because of this feeling of myself and others as the source of an awareness. Therefore, I've always assumed that the others were around there would hear it as I spoke it, as part of our common experience. And when I discovered that people couldn't understand, I've been in retreat from that kind of inwardness, very much hoping to get more immediacy.
I've just noticed on some of your poems there's a date and then the poem, and I just sort of wondered if you saw the person and then walked home and wrote a poem about that, or whether it was an idea in your mind that you put down on paper creating that person or the little boy with toboggan or whatever.
That was real walk in the Don Valley, that thaw one. But I don't know that there was a boy with a toboggan. I think it was a mood of the walk with the recollected people from here and there. And I make the point about the people you can pinch because people that you hear about can be as real imaginatively, and people that have come up out of literature or history can be as real imaginatively as a member of your own family, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So they all have a reality to me if they're there. I don't mock them up as I go, sort of.
Stylistically, do you feel that you do you have favorites of other poets who you feel have influenced your work greatly, or?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Would they be Canadian poets?
Some are, some aren't.
Could you name a few of the...
I think Ray Soster influenced me more for longer, if you believe it. I've learned an awful lot from B.P. Nichol, but I'm not writing as much now. I love reading Leonard Cohen, and his music is the music of his lines and his use of image always refreshes me. I think among Canadians, those are the people I would pick out as influences. I'm sure Elizabeth Bishop has made a permanent impression on the way I use nouns. She's a sort of favorite from one decade to another.
Do you think poetry will eventually just disappear?
Not as long as there are people. It's an inexpensive art form, and that governs a little the place it takes. With the young it's big because it's not expensive to do. Maybe a lot of the people that are writing poetry would be making movies, but for a poem you need wet sand and a stick. That's good enough. Or a good memory. And to make a movie you need a lot of stuff, so there will always be people who will express themselves that way. I think the reading aloud comes because more young people are receiving poetry through the ear now, and I would kind of hope that there's something between drama and poetry reading that is going to come of this. I've seen a few things. I think Kenneth Yukich was out at Scarborough last year. He's got a verse play, about 10 minutes worth, with visuals, because he draws too, which is a new form, it seems to me, and I've seen other poems moving towards this. He projects as a reader of poetry, but it's more private than a play would be. I think there might be new inventions of this kind coming along now.
Most unfortunately, we have no time left, so I would like to thank you very much for a very enjoyable conversation, Miss Avison. Thank you.
I'm very happy to welcome Margaret Avison to Scarborough College. You will hear her in conversation with 3 students from the college and reading some of her own poetry.
I'm John Malette, and with me are Claudette Jones and Mike Caroline. Mike, do you want to begin?
Miss Avison, I was wondering about the marked difference between your earlier poetry and your later works. Your later works seem to have gone through an enlightenment in the view from pessimism to almost religious poetry. Do you feel this way, or was there some reason for this?
Well, yes, I came from a discouraged and inward and thoughtful kind of writing to a period of despair, not writing very much, and a conversion experience which I wrote about. And I believe that there is probably a difference perceptible, as I know there is a difference promised. I don't know that it's a help to the poetry, to be honest, but there is a difference.
There also seems to be a reconciliation with the physical world. How did that happen, or
I
has it
recovered
happened?
my senses. I began to hear again. I began to smell again. It was gradual deadness before, and it was a recovery of sense experience, and it's exciting.
Could you read The Swimmer's Moment? It's one of my favorite poems.
That's fancy because it sounds like a conversion poem. It's written long before, and it isn't at all. So I always like that. The Swimmer's Moment. For everyone, the swimmer's moment at the whirlpool comes. But many at that moment will not say, "This is the whirlpool then." By their refusal, they are saved from the black pit, and also from contesting the deadly rapids and emerging in the mysterious and more ample further waters. And so their bland, blank faces turn and turn pale and forever on the rim of suction they will not recognize. Of those who dare the knowledge, many are whirled into the ominous center that gaping vertical seals up for them an eternal boon of privacy, so that we turn away from their defeat with a despair, not for their deaths, but for ourselves, who cannot penetrate their secret, nor even guess at the anonymous breadth where one or two have won the silver reaches of the estuary.
Thank you.
Are you, or have you ever been a member of a sort of circle of artists, which the activity would influencing your work at all?
I knew in the early days the people that were doing First Statement, Northern Review, these various things that began in the end of the Depression years. Miriam Waddington was in Toronto then, and Miriam Ray Souster and I kept contact with Irving Layton and Louis Dudek and a few of the Montreal people, but I didn't write well when we were reading manuscripts every week, sort of thing. Miriam positively liked that. I think the boys were enjoying getting going in publishing, and they liked it for that reason. I found to get away from literary people kept me writing better. Just the way to be at school. You tend to do your best writing when you're in an atmosphere far away from school. Sid Corman I met through Ray Souster, and the Black Mountain College people I met through Sid, Denise Levertoff, and the group out of Black Mountain around Charles Olson. So that again was a friendship leading to a group that I enjoyed, but it wasn't literary so much as social initially, you know.
So it didn't very specifically influence your
Oh,
work.
very much, yes.
It did.
It was incidental. We didn't form to write. It just grew up as a little community for a while. Yes.
Miss Avison, earlier you were mentioning you were doing work at the Ontario Hospital on Queen Street with people with mental illness. I was wondering if you could explain a bit about that.
They had a man there, he was in his 70s, who used to read with them 1 hour a week, and they loved 2 hours a week, I think he went in. He had an instant illness and died from one Tuesday to the next Thursday. And I was asked by one of the people on staff to go in and do his 2 hour a week, which is now cut down some. I don't go that often, but I go in and read poems of any kind that they seem to respond to, distribute books on the table, and they sometimes choose and read, and I've discovered some poets there too.
Yes, you were mentioning one of the poets you found there. Maybe you could read one of his works for us? Or?
I'd love to. His name is James Angus Brown. I haven't his permission, but I'll get it. I'm sure he wouldn't mind. The Dull Leathery Sky is one of the ones I really like. He reads very flat and stopping at the end of every line, and I'll try and reproduce the way he does it. The dull leathery sky, embracing the purple clouds, kisses the lake with silver rain and breezes that churn the bottom of the waves into breakers over 2 men tall, washing the snow from the sand. I stand tender on the rocky beach, aware that the day disrespects me. I know so by the tone of its voice in color and sound. As the fishes are slashed ashore in foam-white caps, they are carried. I look out to the blending purple-gray horizon to see the angels struggling through the clouds. To abandon this place, I stand raw and gaping, mouth dry, lips tasting the salty breath of the water. There is no other human in my sight, no evidence of man, just my brain touching the day, riding on desolation. I am alone as the day is black. The breakers wash over me, cleansing my soul of yesterday's sorrows. Aware that today is the present. Where do I go in the future? The day offers no inspiration. Inspiration is not black. I think of tomorrow as far away as Jupiter. The present is calling me, always forced back to the present. My eyes see only today's horizon. Tomorrow is washed from view by the rain, and the lake beckons me to kiss her foam of today. Tomorrow will be what I see in it tomorrow.
And this was written by a person who was so-called mentally ill?
Yes. I'd like to get some of his things to some editor somewhere.
This is rather remarkable that,
Well, he's got stacks of manuscript.
Could you express some opinions on your opinions on our environment, particularly our urban environment? Its cement civility.
Do I express them?
Or would you, if you could?
I'm a city mouse. I've never lived except for holidays anywhere else, and then I rebel against it. But I wouldn't be happy outside the city, I think. I like a certain kind of alley with cans in it, and old wood doorways and fences and that kind of cityscape. Very much. That's beautiful to me. Motor cars I'm not at home with yet, and I don't like big highway things. At night they're beautiful. Is that what you mean?
I suppose, yes.
Don't you find the city rather impersonal? I mean, in your poem, To Professor X, Year Y, you seem to be dealing with the impersonalization in the city. Do you disagree with this, or do you really find it impersonal, where everybody is no more than a number?
You can respond to that somehow, though. If that's about a city person, it's also a city person rebelling against it. Like I said, I don't like it, but it's where I live, so you can be personal about being impersonal.
I see what you mean. Perhaps you could read us the poem.
You interrupt me and read it instead if you want, one of you, because my voice gets so dead. To Professor X, Year Y. This is in the old city hall, facing towards the lake, Queen and Bay. The square for civic receptions is jammed, static, black with people in top coats, although November is mean and day grows late. The newspapermen who couldn't force their way home after the council meeting, etc., move between windows and press room in ugly humor. They do not know what everybody is waiting for at this hour, to stand, masked and unmoving, where there should be, well, nothing to expect except the usual hubbub of city 5 o'clock. Winter pigeons walk the cement ledges, urbane, discriminating. Down in the silent crowd, few can see anything. It is disgusting, this uniformity of stature. If only someone climbed in pyramid as circus families can. Strictly each knows downtown buildings block all view anyway, except to tease them 4 narrow passages and one clear towards open water. If clear suits with the prune and mottled plumes of Madam Night. Nobody gapes skyward, although the notion of commerce by air is utterly familiar. Many citizens at this hour are, of course, miles away under rumpus room lamps, dining room chandeliers, or bound elsewhere. One girl who waits in a lit drugstore doorway north 48 blocks for the next bus. carries a history, an ethics, a Russian grammar, and a pair of gym shoes. But the few thousand inexplicably here generate funny currents, zigzag across the leaden miles, and all suburbia suffers uneasily. You, historian, looking back at us, do you think I'm not trying to be helpful? If I fabricated cause and effect, you'd listen? I've been dead too long for fancies. Ignore us hunched in these dark streets if in a minute now the explosive meaning fails to disperse us and provide resonance appropriate to your chronicle. But if you do, I have a hunch you've missed a portent. 20 of 6. No, I wouldn't wonder. Terrible last line. Coy. It won't read. It's in quotation marks and nobody's saying it.
Thank you.
I'm ashamed.
With no pun intended, could you comment on concrete poetry? You don't seem to employ it yourself, that technique of...
I've done one or two. When I first knew B.P. Nichol, he was a stack boy and I had a stack Carol, and we used to leave notes for each other in concrete. And I get great pleasure from it. I've got one down there of Ian Hamilton Finley's that I carry around everywhere. There's one called Tree in the first modern poetry selection. You, me, and a lot of things coming out. It's just delicious. It's a wit form. I'm not sure it's a poetic form any more than a wit form. Just like some jokes are good literature.
Could you resolve the paradox of writing a sonnet against sonnets, although it is...
That's what the sonnet does. Doesn't it?
Yes.
Just promises not to write any more, and I haven't. But you have to take your leave gracefully, so...
Okay.
Miss Avison, maybe you could read us a few of the poems that you feel mean something to you, or have some particular meaning to you.
I came with lots of poems. There's one I found. I was delighted with this anthology, the Penguin Book of Animal Verse, which is alphabetical by animal. And one of the ones I've been delighted by this year, which is very much welcomed by the people in that hospital group. They like this too. The Frog Prince by Stevie Smith. It says Stevie Smith, 20th century, at the end of the poem. I am a frog. I live under a spell. I live at the bottom of a green well. And here I must wait until a maiden places me on her royal pillow and kisses me in her father's palace. The story is familiar. Everybody knows it well. But do other enchanted people feel as nervous as I do? The stories do not tell. Ask if they will be happier when the changes come, as already they are fairly happy in a frog's doom. I have been a frog now for 100 years, and in all this time I have not shed many tears. I am happy, I like the life. When I have hopped to the river, can swim for many a mile, and am forever agile. And the quietness, yes, I like to be quiet. I am habituated to a quiet life. But always when I think these thoughts, as I sit in my well, another thought comes to me and says, it is part of the spell, to be happy, to work up contentment, to make much of being a frog, to fear disenchantment. It says, it will be heavenly to be set free, cries, heavenly, the girl who disenchants in the royal times, heavenly, and I think it will be. Come then, royal girl and royal times, come quickly. I can be happy until you come, but I cannot be heavenly. Only disenchanted people can be heavenly.
Maybe that appeals to them because they feel themselves that they are disenchanted people. The people at the hospital I'm referring to.
Yes, I think they're winning somewhere into that. I think so. I think that's a real communally written poem where poet and times meet somehow.
Do you write it all in prose?
haven't a voice of my own in prose, really. I try to. All my life I try to. I've done a lot of ghostwriting, and I think that spoiled it. I've done a lot of essays, and I think that spoiled it.
You said earlier that you hope someday to be able to write nursery rhymes. Do you think that would be very difficult?
Well, actually, nursery rhymes aren't written. They come from so far back that for me to write them, I guess I'd have to have died. It's a kind of being whopped up in all-time language, and you get that.
You don't think there could be such a thing as a modern nursery rhyme? Like, I don't understand what you mean when you say that.
Well, the real nursery rhymes come on and on and on, like the bouncing ball rhymes and so on. They're timeless, and they turn up all over the place, anonymous, you know. I'd like to get to be anonymous in my writing.
Thank you very much.